waiting for other people to join us. I hope you can hear me and see me. Okay, Tanya, maybe we shall start. No? Tanya Filipova is the moderator of today's lecture, and she's solving technical issues as well, but it looks like everything works. So I guess we can start. Tanya. I can't see her. Let me check. Hello, Tanya. Let's start.
Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the online course on East Caucasian languages, organized by the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory of the HEC University, located in Moscow, Russia. My name is Tatyana Filipova, and I'm a senior research fellow in the lab and the moderator of today's session. Today we have the first lecture in the series of 13, which is entitled Language Size, Multilingualism, and Marriage Patterns in Daghestan. It will be given by the head of our lab, Professor Nina Dobrushina. But before introducing our speaker, I would like to clarify some organizational issues. So for you to know, each lecture will be recorded, live streamed on YouTube, and stored there afterwards so that you could watch it later. The lecture will go uninterrupted, followed by a question period. So those of you who are joining us via Zoom will be muted throughout the session in the interest of the lecturer and sound quality. And please send your question via the Zoom chat or YouTube live chat, depending on where you're connecting from. At the end of the talk, I will read selected questions out loud for the speaker, in this case, Nina, to answer them. And we apologize in advance that there might not be enough time to address all the questions, but Nina will be able to read them after the talk, and hopefully will find a way to answer you. So it is my real pleasure to introduce Nina Dobrushina, the head of the Linguistic Convergence Lab and professor of the School of Linguistics of the HSC University in Moscow, Russia. Nina has diverse research interests, including Russian linguistics, the grammar of Daghestanian languages, and of course sociolinguistics and the study of multilingualism and language contact in Daghestan. She has performed extensive fieldwork on a number of underdescribed Daghestani languages, also regularly taking students on field trips to the villages of Daghestan. Nina is also an expert in the semantics of non-indicative moods. In 2016, she was conferred the degree of Doctor of Science for a dissertation on this topic. This was followed by a sabbatical year in Lyon, supported by the prestigious Marie Curie Fellowship. And Nina has published in such high-profile journals as Linguistics, Journal of Language Variation and Change, International Journal of Bilingualism, and Journal of Sociolinguistics. She authored 2 monographs and edited or co-edited 6 books, the most recent being the collection of grammatical essays on Mehweb, an East Caucasian language belonging to the Dargwa group. This book was published by Language Science Press and is open access. Today, Nina will give us an overview lecture on language size, multilingualism, and marriage patterns in Daghestan. Nina, the floor, or I should rather say the Zoom space, is all yours. Please.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So now I will share my screen with you. Yeah, this looks like to be the proper one. Yep. Okay. So let's start. Thank you very much for this introduction. I hope you can see my screen now. And welcome to our course on East Caucasian languages, or Daghestanian languages, which is the same. I will start with briefly introducing to you the lab which organized this course. We work in general on language contexts and especially on the languages of Russia, but we focus on Dagestan, and we are doing a lot of different things in this respect. We study minority languages and dialects. We collect texts and create corpora. We work on typological atlas of Dagestan. We document Daghestanian multilingualism. We digitalized historical data on the population of Dagestan, and we study language contact through lexical borrowings. And here you can see the links to the numerous resources which we created and we support. They are all open, so please, you're welcome to use them. Now, I'm starting with my lecture, which is about language size, multilingualism, and marriage patterns in Dagestan. I'm a bit embarrassed to be the first one, because actually it should have been Johanna Nichols, not me, but unfortunately she could not do it tomorrow. So I'm opening this course and I hope you will enjoy it. This is my plan. I will start with a brief introduction. Then I will talk about marriage patterns and language size as factors of linguistic diversity in Dagestan. And then I will turn to the patterns of multilingualism and its dynamics. And this is the map where you can see where Dagestan is located. You can see that this is the part of Russia, a republic of Russia, Eastern Caucasus, and Dagestan borders with Azerbaijan, with Georgia, and with Chechnya. It has a line of coast of the Caspian Sea, but its most part is in rather high mountains. Dagestan is rather diverse in terms of geography and economy. While lowlands are quite rich and fertile, mountains are scarce and poor. And it is known for its extreme linguistic density because more than 40 languages are spoken on a territory of about 50,000 kilometers. These languages belong to three language families. Daghestanian family is indigenous to this territory. And I should make my first excuse that I will speak almost exclusively about languages of Dagestan and almost never mention two Nakh languages, Chechen and Ingush, in this lecture, for the simple reason that I've never worked on them. I've never been there. I have no field data on these territories. But the good news is that Johanna Nichols, who is our next lecturer, she has her lecture on Friday, don't miss it, please. She is an expert on Ingush and on Chechen, so you can address your questions to her. So Daghestanian family is the biggest one, but there are also three Turkic languages in Dagestan, Kumyk, Nagai, and Azerbaijani, and one in the European language, which is Tat. And even related languages are considerably different because the family is old and is deep, and so languages are not mutually understandable at all. So several Daghestanian languages are spoken beyond Dagestan in modern Azerbaijan. And what is especially important is that languages are quite vital. They are still spoken and transmitted to the children in the villages. I should also mention that in spite of this linguistic diversity, Dagestan is rather homogeneous in cultural terms. Dagestanis were sedentary food producers for a long period of time. They are Muslims, apart from one Jewish community of Tats, who were numerous, but now they are almost gone from Dagestan. Their food, clothes, traditions, and architecture have lots in common, although there are numerous distinctions as well. For example, in the way how to cook hinkali, or there used to be a lot of distinctions in clothes and so on. So this is the picture of one of the very vital, very lively Dagestanian traditions, the dance of Lizginka, which is called Lizginka. You will find it everywhere, and it is not related to lesbians because the very word lesbian meant just someone from Dagestan, just mountain people. So this is the picture from the village in Rutul, from the wedding in Rutul village of Kina. And here you can see children who started to dance. And this picture shows you Moscow students at the same wedding. They were had a lot of success. The whole village laughed at them and still loves to remember how Moscow students danced at this wedding. So until recently, the Daghestanian mountains were more inhabited than lowlands for various reasons. This means that there was a lack of flat surface and a lack of arable land. So the climate was quite severe, especially in high mountains. So life was not easy. People experienced hunger till maybe 1970s. And yeah, so this is the picture which shows you typical Daghestanian landscape. This is the beginning of May, and you can see that there is not a lot of forest in Daghestan. This is also typical for the whole territory of Daghestan. It lacks forest. It is due partially to the Caucasian War, which happened in 19th century. There was a military deforestation, but this is not the only reason for the lack of forest. Yeah, and you can also see a village here, but this is not a traditional layout for the village. So let me show you another picture with the village of Kumyk. So what you can see here is these stone-built houses which formed dense terraces and were located on the steep slope in order to spare arable land. Here you can see the remnants of the old houses which were built from the same stone as from which the mountain consists. So the main occupations was herding, and especially sheep, but also cattle, and in the lowland, buffaloes. And also agriculture, although in the highlands, it was almost exclusively cereal grain, such as rye, wheat, and barley, and almost no vegetables, and definitely no fruits. For example, in Archib, the highland village, people had no vegetables and fruits, I think, till 70s. It is different in the lowlands. You will find there maize, potato, apricots, and grapes, so it's much more fertile. But the most Dagestan was in rather high mountains. This is another picture, which honestly I took from the internet because I didn't find a good one in our own archives. You can see here the traces of terrace farming. That's how people, that's how people planted their crops. So they made these steps in order to protect crops from rain and water and wind. So life was quite severe. And villages were very stable. So they were stable for centuries or even for millennia. Historians find Arabic inscriptions in the villages starting from 10th century. And these villages were characterized by a high level of mutual social dependence of the villagers from one another. So they had to coordinate their actions because life was so difficult. And the main body of traditional village administration was so-called jamaat, which means simply village people. So Jamaat made important decisions about the life of the village. families were quite large, with very strong ties between its members. Even now, aunts and uncles and cousins are very important in one's life. So you have to help them, you can count on them. So families were very tight. And there were patrilineal clans, which are called tuhums, which, unlike Chechen and Ingush tapes, are discontinuous. They are limited to the village. And another, Daghestanians practiced virilocality, which means that wife moved to, and still moves actually, to her husband's place. And there was an important feature of marriage patterns, which is endogamy. And so the next part of my talk will be devoted to marriage patterns and language size. So strict endogamy is typical for most of Dagestan. It means that people practice marriages, or practiced marriages, because this tradition is not as alive as it used to be, within the community of the village. In some villages, it was clearly clan-based. For example, in Archib, marriages used to be within the tuhums, within the clans, which is even narrower than a village. But in some other villages, people at least do not remember about endogamy being clan-based, so their marriages were limited to other residents of the village. Endogamy had a practical motivation. As I said, Dagestan was scarce in land, so land was extremely valuable. It belonged to individuals, but the right of transfer was heavily restricted. It was controlled by Jamaat. So you could not sell your land into another community without the permission of Jamaat. And the amount of the fine for selling land to an outsider was more than the fine for a murder. And since in most of Dagestan, both sons and daughters inherited the land, and as I said, daughter moved to her husband's place. So if she married a man from another village, then the land became a property of another village, which was extremely undesirable. So inter-village marriages were disapproved. And there are evidences that Daghestani endogamy is quite old. Interestingly, what we know from many descriptions of indigenous multilingual communities, endogamy is rather unusual. Unusual for the areas with a so-called small-scale multilingualism. Most reports about such communities describe obligatory or widely spread exogamy. And endogamy is not typical of the rest of the Caucasus, except for Azerbaijan. For example, Chechens and Ingushs practiced clan-based exogamy. They were not endogamous. So, as I said, linguistic exogamy is often linked with the small size of language groups. You can see these quotations which say that in small groups, outmarriage is common. And so Singer and Harris suggested several properties typical of small-scale multilingual communities. And among these properties, they say that each indigenous language has a small number of speakers, which is less than 500, according to Singer and Harris, who work in Australia. And marriages between people with different main languages is obligatory or common. So we can suggest that probably Daghestani endogamy is due to the larger size of speakers' communities. Because at first glance, this is true. The size of language groups at the present time is larger than 5,000 people. So even such minority languages as Sahur or Rutul or Karata are larger, and there are also quite large language groups such as Avars or Kumyks or Lesgians. But we have to remember that there were significant demographic changes in 20th century. And the population of most villages increased because of improved life conditions and because of medical service. So in general, the population of Daghestan has increased. Although the population of some villages decreased because of voluntary and involuntary relocations. Some villages disappeared because of that. So, but we should look at an earlier period in order to understand the traditional population of Daghestani languages. So that is why we undertook the digitalization of historical censuses of Daghestan, and you can find them on this site. And now we know that at least in the beginning of the 20th century, according to the census of 1926, which is considered as the most reliable census in Soviet Union, language groups were much smaller, like 5 or 3 times smaller than they are now. So our study showed that according to the census of 1926, 70% of languages had less than 5,000 speakers. So it means that the size of language population is comparable to that which is described, which is documented for Australia or Papua New Guinea. And I should also say that endogamy was typical even of smallest language communities. For example, one of the most strict marriage policies we found in the village of Archib, which was never, so Archie never had more than 1,200 speakers, it seems. So, of course, we can't say for sure, but at least in the end of the 19th century, they had about 800 speakers. So why am I so insistent talking about marriage patterns? Why are they important for linguists? Because if language communities are small, then frequent exogamous marriages enhance multilingualism. In exogamous marriage, add a new language to the family, and then children grow up with 2 or more languages. So exogamous marriages lead to early bilingualism. And we know that early bilingualism is quite important for language evolution because early bilinguals acquire second languages in their full complexity. They don't simplify them, unlike late bilinguals. And there is another assumption, another hypothesis that early bilingualism leads to complexification of first languages due to this constant language contact. So this is why I undertook the study of Daghestani marriage patterns and I did it through the rare cases of mixed marriages. So I made a field research of linguistic behavior of unmarried women in 18 villages, part of them in southern Dagestan and part in other areas of Dagestan. And one of my conclusions is that exogamous marriages, the marriages with the residents of other villages, were never completely excluded. So in every village, there are several mixed families. Some villages used to have more strict endogamy, such as Archib or Kubachi. Some seem not to show traces of endogamy at all. At least they don't remember that they used to have it, such as Lesgian village Tsnal. And mixed marriage always involved residents of adjacent villages, even in the villages where endogamous marriages were not prohibited. These marriages occurred under some special circumstances. So usually they happened to one who could not easily find a partner in the home village. Very often it was not a first marriage. So widower, for example, usually looked for a second wife in another villages, not in his own village. And these exogamous marriages were also typical for orphans, because as one woman told me, she said, well, he was an orphan. Who would marry him? Girls always marry the rich. An orphan who has nothing, no one loves such people, do they? People who experience some physical disabilities, for example, were lame, they also probably got married to another village. And attitudes towards these mixed marriages were rather negative. So leaving home village was considered bad luck. For example, a woman from Khnov quoted her grandmother, who used to say that however bad the man from the same village, better to marry him than someone from elsewhere. And living home village was stigmatized for women. It was associated with some kind of dishonor. It probably meant that she was dishonest. It was a disgrace. So there are these Avar proverbs which literally say, a good cow will not cross the river. Or in another village, a good horse will not cross the river, a good girl will not leave her village. Now coming to the issue of languages, if the adjacent village speaks a different language, then this mixed marriage would cross the language border. But even if the adjacent village speaks the same language, then there would be a language issue, because this incoming woman most likely speaks another dialect. Usually there are at least slight dialectal distinctions even between very closely located villages. So what happened in this case? What I found out is that the incoming wife was expected to learn the language of her husband and to communicate with her husband using this language, with her husband, his family, and other villagers. In my database, there are only 3 women who do not speak the languages of their husbands, and 2 of these 3 women are non-Daghestanians. One is Russian and another one is Chechen. It is a very untypical marriage for the highland village, but it happened but usually such couples would reside not in the village but in the towns. So this new language was most often acquired during the first year. And my question to you is, why do you think it was acquired why women usually say that they acquired the language of the husband during the first year? I would not be able to give justice to your answers, but still you can answer in the chat and to do it quickly because I will soon answer it. So interestingly, the performance of these incoming women in the second language was usually highly evaluated by other villages. So when I asked their relatives or other villagers or their neighbors whether this woman speaks good their language, the very common answer which I got all around Dagestan is, she speaks better than us. So it looks like they are slightly exaggerating the performance of these incoming women, probably because they want to be sure that everyone in their village speaks their language. Even these incoming women. So even if there are several women from the same village who got married to the same settlement, which is in general not very typical, but this is the case of the Rutul village of Kina. There are about a dozen of women from Tsakhur village, Helmets. So even in this case, they communicate in the language of their husbands. For example, in Kina, there is a family where mother-in-law and daughter-in-law are both from the same Tsakhur village, but they speak to each other in Rutul. And when I asked the mother-in-law why so, she said, we speak the language of the place whose bread we eat. But interestingly, what I found out, this is different if wife speaks another dialect, not another language, but another dialect. So I made this research in the areas speaking Dargwa varieties. There were cross-dialect marriages, and what I found out is that the incoming wives were expected to keep their dialects, not to shift to the dialect of their husbands. For example, there was a woman who married from the village Urari to the village Sudbuk, and her dialect is very similar to Sudbuk's. There are quite slight distinctions. And she said that she does not speak Sudbuk dialect, and she doesn't want to speak it. She told me that she would be hurt if her parents or her ex-villagers would say, look, you're speaking Sudbuk. And there was an old man from another village of the same area who said, it is a disgrace for women who, in marriage, if she doesn't speak her own language, her patrilect. People would say she has sold her language for bread. So what we see from these stories is that these unmarried women kept identifying themselves with their patrilects, and they could be reproached for abandoning them. For example, there is an Avar woman in a Rutul village, which is quite unusual because Avars and Rutuls reside in different parts in Daghestan, and normally they would not meet in a traditional situation. And she decided not to teach her children Avar, her native language. But she complained that some Rutul people reproached her that she has sold her own language. So these unmarried women find themselves between these two loyalties, the loyalty to their patrilect and the loyalty to the language of the village where they reside. So this probably is also one of the reasons why these cross marriages are so undesirable. This is the picture just to make the story less boring. This is a lucky woman from Archip. She never experienced such a horrible marriage and spent all her life in her native village. So what happened with children? What I found out is that children speak only patrilect in their early childhood. And here is the answer to my question. So why women insist on acquiring the language of their husband during their first year? Because in the end of the first year of marriage, they usually have their first child. And unmarried women have to speak the language of the husband to their children. So children might acquire the language of their mothers, but usually from the communication with their maternal relatives. For example, when they spend summer vacations in their mother's village. Mother can start teaching her children her native language, but only when they grow up and when they have already acquired their patrilect. And sometimes she can even be reproached for not doing it by her husband and her mother-in-law. Because, as I was also frequently told, speaking several languages is beautiful. So Daghestanian people in general value multilingualism. They consider it good for their children to speak several languages. So elder children often speak both languages, elder children in mixed families, right? They often speak both languages, but the command of matrilect is usually worse. So there are two conclusions from this study about language ideology typical for highland Daghestan. First is that people identify themselves strictly with their patrilects, irrespective of where they live and what is the language of their husband or mother. And the second conclusion is that language belongs to the village rather than to the father. I was very lucky to come across one case of husband's relocation. In general, as I said, marriages are strictly very local, so men do not relocate. But this man was born in an Agul village, and he married a woman from a Dagwa village. And for some unknown reasons, he had to move to her village. I was unable to talk to him. He was dead at the moment when I heard his story. I talked to his daughter. So what his daughter told me is that he spoke to his children not in his native language, but in Amukhtargva, in the language of his wife and of the village where he lived. And when I asked his daughter why he did so, she said, well, because it's a Dagwa village, so everyone speaks Dagwa. So the in-group communication was performed only in the language of the village. I can also mention that languages in Dagestan are usually named after villages. Even now, when people are well aware of these larger labels such as Dagwa or Lezgin or Avar, they still quite often name languages after villages, like Kininski язык, the Kina language, or Tlibishinsky, Tlibisho language, the language of the village Tlibisho. So exogamous marriages were reanalyzed in endogamous pattern. Language differences were not taken into account in the rare cases of exogamous marriages. And these marriages were treated in such a way that they would fit into an otherwise fully endogamous society. They did not lead to a new language coming to the village, and they did not lead to an early multilingualism in children. The community digested these intermarriages without adapting to them. So this principle of linguistic homogeneity was sustained. And as a result of endogamy, highland villages in Dagestan are ethnically and linguistically very homogeneous. And as many researchers supposed, endogamy contributed to the linguistic diversity of Dagestan. Also because this rule of speaking the language of the village was equally applied to all local languages, irrespective of their size or of their status. For example, if an Avar woman, so who the speaker of the major Daghestanian language, married to Archib or to Mehweb, which both were minority languages, one village languages, she still had to shift to the language of her husband and speak it till the end of her life. So now I'm turning to the last part of my talk, which is about the patterns of multilingualism and the dynamics of multilingualism. Here I listed the key features of multilingualism in Dagestan. First feature is that villages with different local languages are often located within walking distance from one another. And the main source of multilingualism is the communication with the residents of these adjacent villages. These contacts were presumably quite stable because villages were stable, as I said in the beginning. Second languages were not used within the family, nor were they used with the residents of the same village. So it was not a daily practice to speak second languages. It was rather maybe weekly practice. You spoke them when you met your neighbors, the residents of the adjacent villages. And second languages were acquired in the adolescence or later. It is important for us that traditional patterns of multilingualism are still traceable. I can't say that they are well preserved because the communication in local second languages now is under the way of being displaced by Russian. So people still speak their first languages and transmit them to their children, but they already do not acquire second languages and often prefer Russian to communicate to the adjacent villages. This picture shows you how villages with different languages can be located. This is the village of Mehweb, where people speak a minority language, Mehweb. And this is the village of Sagratl, where people speak Avar. This is a walking distance, not the closest one, but still doable. And this picture shows you the case of language contact. So these are Archie women who talk to a tradesman. You can see him here, his back, who came to Archib to sell fruits. And we can be sure that they talked to him in Avar because he definitely did not speak Archi. So in order to study the patterns of multilingualism, we undertook, we applied what we call the method of retrospective family interviews, which is actually quite a simple thing. We take short interviews about language repertoires of the local people. So we ask them which languages do they speak. But we also ask them about their elder relatives, about their parents and grandparents whom they remember. Why do we do so? Because from the establishment of Soviet schools in the 1930s, Russian spread all over Daghestan as second language. So these traditional language repertoires have been almost completely ousted by Russian as a lingua franca. You can see it in this picture. It shows the dynamics of the command of second languages in Mehweb. These are years of birth, and this is a number of people bilingual in second languages. So what you can see in this picture is that in the end of 19th century and in the beginning of 20th, almost no one could speak Russian, but everyone spoke Avar and Lak because Avars and Laks are neighbors. While at the present time, people born after 1960s do not speak Lak anymore, and younger people do not speak Avar as well, while 100% of residents of this village, starting from 1950s years of birth, speak Russian. So what we do, we collect data in teams. Usually we go to the field in a team of about 10 people, 2 or 3 supervisors and 6 aid students. We choose a village on the border of 2 languages, and we work in this village and in the adjacent villages, in the villages which are reachable by foot. So far, we undertook field trips to 19 groups of villages, 19 geographical clusters. In total, we surveyed 68 villages. This is the map which shows these 19 clusters all over Daghestan. And this is the picture which shows how one of our students takes interview in the field. This is another picture when this crowd, woman crowd, waits for the bride. This is a wedding day. And you can see my back and the back of one of our students we are taking these short interviews. So this is the slide about problems and restrictions of this method, but I guess I should skip it, and I can address you to the paper which we submitted recently, which statistically compares the results of direct and indirect answers. So of the answers when the individual speaks about her own language repertoire, comparing to the cases when the individual speaks about the language repertoire of her parents or grandparents. And the conclusion is that they are quite similar. There's no big difference between direct and indirect answers. This is the screenshot from our database of multilingualism of Daghestan. We put all quantitative data online immediately after we come from the field, and everyone can use it. It is open. So now I will briefly tell you about some results. So first, we should distinguish between what we call distant and vicinal second languages, or adjacent second languages, or neighboring second languages. We are still choosing the term, but in this talk I will use the term vicinal. So distant languages are spoken beyond the neighborhood. They are acquired beyond the neighborhood. And they are acquired in the course of seasonal activities rather than weekly activities. So, for example, in some parts of Dagestan, people used to undertake seasonal shepherding when they went with their sheep to the distant mountains for several months and met their speakers of other languages. But there were other practices, such as, for example, taking part in seasonal oil extraction in Azerbaijan, which was typical for some parts of southern Dagestan. Or there were villages such as Balkhar, where pottery was made, and people used to go to some distant parts of Dagestan to sell their pottery. So some people in Balkhar can speak Avar for this reason. It was also used to go tinning. Especially it was typical for Lak people, but also for Archi people, for example. And this is how they acquired Azerbaijani. So this is about distant languages, while vicinal languages were spoken in the adjacent villages, and they were acquired in the course of weekly activities, such as, for example, cultivating fields, because fields usually had a border with the fields of the neighbors of the adjacent village. So you had to communicate with your neighbor sometimes when you cultivated the field or you mowed or something like that. People used to go to visit each other, to go to weddings or funerals or some other events in the adjacent villages. Or also they used to exchange goods, of course, because, for example, in one village, there could be better conditions for, I don't know, wheat, while the adjacent village could have better better pastures for their cattle. And so you would exchange your wheat for meat or something like that. So why do we need to distinguish between these types of multilingualism? Because first, they differ with respect to the number of bilingual people. There are much more people bilingual in vicinal languages. Actually, usually, quite often, most of the population of the village can speak the language of their neighbors. While distant languages were typical, the knowledge of distant languages was typical only for a small part of villagers. And these two types of languages are also asymmetrical in terms of gender, because females always speak vicinal languages, but they usually did not speak distant languages because they stayed at home. They had to stay at home to look for the cattle, for children, while men went for these several seasonal activities. So here you can see this chart, which was created by Georges Maros, which shows that this chart is for multilingualism in distant vicinal languages before 1919 year of birth, so before Russian came to Daghestan. And you can see that the bilingualism in vicinal languages is almost the same for females and for males, while the bilingualism in distant languages is quite different. This is the picture for our whole database, for all villages where we made this survey, where we collected data. So now I want to speak about the typical patterns of bilingualism in vicinal languages. So linguists distinguish between three types of bilingualism. First type can be called symmetrical bilingualism. It means that if you have two adjacent villages speaking different languages, then the level of the command, the number of people bilingual in these languages is comparable, is similar in these two villages. So both villages speak the languages of their neighbors. But what we found out is that such cases are quite untypical for Daghestan. There are some, but they are rare. More frequent are two other cases, two other patterns. In some areas of Daghestan, people used to speak to each other using lingua franca. For example, Tsahur and Rutul people from southern Daghestan, used for the communication between themselves, used Azerbaijani. So Azerbaijani was the lingua franca of southern Daghestan. While in some parts of central Daghestan, there were other lingua franca, Avar and Kumyk. For example, Akhvakh and Karata people used to communicate in Avar. And there are plenty of cases of asymmetrical bilingualism. So when this means that the two villages communicate in the language of one of these two villages, but only one of the two village populations has a decent command of the language of the other village. I guess I can show you some examples. So these are the pairs of adjacent villages. For example, Shalib, the village where people speak Lak, and Chitab, this is the village where people speak Avar. There's a distance about 1 hour and a half of walking. And you can see that their relations in terms of languages were rather symmetrical. So 62% of the population of Shalib could speak Avar, and 58% of the population of Chitab could speak Shalib. This is the case of symmetrical bilingualism, but it is rather untypical. These blue ones are the cases of lingua franca. So, for example, here you can see that Rutul people in Kina, that only 27% of Rutul people in the village Kina could speak the language of their neighbors. But their neighbors, Tahur people from the village of Kelmets, also did not have a high level of the command of Rutul. Only 20% of them could speak it. Why? Because they communicated in Azerbaijani and they used lingua franca for the communication. So, this is to some extent the answer to the question, which language was chosen for the communication when the relations were asymmetrical. So how the language was chosen? What we found out is that this asymmetry was to a large extent dictated by the size of language population. The size of language population at the local level. So this graph shows you that smaller language communities, this is the number of L1 speakers. So, for example, these groups these language groups have about 5, 10, 20, 25,000 speakers. And they are more multilingual than the members of the speakers of the large languages, such as Avars or Lesgians or Kumyk. They used to speak, quite often they were monolingual. So, the summary so far, the empirical summary is that adjacent villages always had some means of communication, and most often it was one of the two vicinal languages. It seems that lingua franca was less frequent, and bilingualism between adjacent villages was most often asymmetrical. And this is the kind of theoretical summary, because this study of Daghestani multilingualism can contribute to our knowledge of the typology of small-scale multilingualism. As I said in the beginning, so there are several assumptions which are not true for Daghestan. One of them is that, as I said, the areas of small-scale multilingualism are characterized by exogamy. And this is not true for Daghestan. As I showed, small language groups practiced endogamous marriages. The second idea is that the areas of stable multilingualism are characterized by the absence of language dominance. And this is also not true for Daghestan. It seems that multilingualism was stable, but language dominance still existed in this area. Then there is an idea that a frequent corollary of asymmetrical bilingualism is language shift. So when the relations are asymmetrical, one community speaks the language of another community while the second community does not, then it is quite likely that first community would shift at some point to the language of the dominant community. And this is also not true in Daghestan, because the common pattern was asymmetrical, but it really led to language shift, at least in the observable past. We don't know of any cases of language shift, at least as far as we have documentation. And I think that one of the explanations for this stability of linguistic diversity lies in the linguistic ideology of Daghestan, which I showed you when I talked about endogamous marriages. So the asymmetry of bilingual patterns was balanced by the strict association of one village to one language, which did not depend on the size of language or on its local importance. So languages were asymmetrical on the one hand, but equal on the other hand, in the sense that the rules were equally applied to all languages. So now I'm coming to the end, but I want to briefly tell you what happened next. So what is the dynamics of the multilingualism in Daghestan? The Soviet anthropologist Volkova says that in the end of 19th century, there was only one person per 1,000 who could speak some Russian. But in 1930s, Soviet authorities opened Soviet schools in every single village of highland Dagestan. And the education was obligatory for all villagers. Russian language was one of the main subjects in these schools. And in 1950s, after the war, there was a campaign, an educational campaign, when Russian teachers were sent to the highland villages of Dagestan to teach Russian and to teach other subjects in Russian, of course, because they didn't speak local languages. So this is the picture which I'm proud of, because I found it in one of family archives in Archiv. You can see here Archie people who built the road. These are men and these are Archie women. And this European-like woman is a Russian teacher, a young woman who was born in 1930, and when she graduated and was 20-something, she was sent to this highland village of Dagestan to teach local people. She spent there about 30 years. She married a Lak man, she had 3 children, and she never acquired any local language, neither Archie nor the language of her husband, Lak. She did not speak them. So what we found out when we analyzed the dynamics of command in Russian language in our database is that the number of people bilingual in Russian has drastically increased in 1930s. So you can see the slip. And after 1950s years of birth, these are years of birth, after 1950s years of birth, almost everyone in highland Daghestan can speak Russian. So Russian became first all Daghestanian lingua franca which covers all areas of Dagestan. And as I said, it ousted the command of other second languages. So this is why we think that the documentation of the patterns of multilingualism in Dagestan is a quite urgent matter. This is a collective project. Many people took part in the field work, especially the students of High School of Economics, and also Michael Daniels, who took part in everything I did. I also owe to the hospitality of Dagestanian people. We are very lucky with the field because Dagestan is a very open, very hospitable, very easy to communicate, and eager to share with us their knowledge. I'm also very grateful to Rasul Mutalov, who helped us many times to organize our field trips, to Yuri Krikov, who has made all the maps, to George Maros, or Garik Maros, and Oля Kultepina, who made statistics for me, and for the discussion of the results, for the support, and for the help to the fellows of Linguistic Convergence Laboratory. And so these are some pictures of our field teams. And I also want to remind you that next lecture will take place on Friday, so in 2 days, and this will be a lecture by Johanna Nichols. And I hope you will attend it, as well as further lectures, which will be held on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Moscow time. Thank you for your attention. You're welcome to attend. And now I can take some questions. I hope that I still have time for it. Thank you.
Nina, thank you very much. Thank you on behalf of all the participants. And I would like to read some questions to you out loud. Both participants ask questions both in Zoom and on YouTube. So the first question from Alice Smith from YouTube. How common was and is polygamy in Dagestan? I assume during Soviet times it was forbidden.
Yes, indeed. It was forbidden in Soviet times, but as far as I know, I might be mistaken in here, but as far as I know, it was not very spread even before Soviet times. It was not very typical for Dagestan. One of the reasons is probably that, as I said, Dagestanis were Highlanders, were rather poor, life was difficult, so having several wives was not simple. Yeah, maybe this is one of the reasons, but anyway, it was not very used, even at that time. And now we sometimes meet polygamous marriages, but quite infrequent. So most often you wouldn't find a single polygamous family in a large village. It is not very typical of Dagestan.
Thank you, Nina. So the next question is from Sara Dopirala. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right. She's asking the following. I'm just wondering what it means for the children to grow up before they learn their mother's language. Does that mean they have grown older but are still children? Or does it mean that they don't start learning until they're technically adults?
Okay, I'm sorry if this was not clear. So what I meant is that children in these mixed marriages, which are rare, but still they exist. So in the mixed marriages, children are not taught their mother's language until they are, well, maybe 10 or 11 or 12, not earlier. So toddlers never speak more than one other languages apart from their patrilect. That's what I meant.
Okay, thank you, Nina. So going to the next question from Chuck Donnet. What do you mean when you're saying someone could speak the language? To what level, what domains, and etc. I have found many people say they can speak a language, but we find out they only know a few greetings and key phrases. Was this taken into consideration as data on multilingualism was collected?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. This is indeed an important issue because when we undertake these brief interviews, we are of course unable to check the performance, to check whether the individual indeed can speak the language which she reports she can speak. So this is a problem, but and of course, sometimes it could be that people exaggerate their knowledge, that they claim they are speaking the language while they are not. But in our experience, this is rather untypical. Why? Because the community is very tight in Daghestani villages, and people know very well things about other people. So if one individual would say that he speaks, I don't know, Avar or Kumyk, while in reality he does not, then immediately someone would tell about him that he lies. And this is really a working mechanism. People can't lie about those things because everyone knows very well who is speaking which languages or not. But of course, it could be that there might be this kind of biases in our data. I agree. It is possible.
Thank you, Nina. So we're on to the next question from Rich Meister, who joined us on YouTube. He's saying the following. Since asymmetrical bilingualism is more common than the use of a lingua franca, is it reasonable to assume that this is why there is so much lexical sharing in Daghestanian languages?
Lexical sharing.
So can we say that lexical sharing, extensive lexical sharing is due to asymmetrical bilingualism?
Well, I don't know what you mean by lexical sharing. If you mean the, do you mean the loans or the basic vocabulary? if you mean the loans, then I can address you to the paper by Michael Daniel and his co-authors, which where they studied the loans in number of dialects and languages of Daghestan. And they showed indeed that the number of loans from lingua franca is usually larger than the number of loans from the adjacent languages, so to say. So lingua franca influenced the lexicon more significantly than this kind of local bilingualism. But thank you for this question. It's an interesting one.
Thank you very much, Nina. There is also a question from Olga Baranova. In what way do they, well, the Daghestanians, praise multilingualism if they don't generally approve of mixed marriages and seem to endure them as forced?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it? I missed the first part of the question.
I'll probably try to rephrase it maybe. Basically the question is about the compatibility of what you're saying about Daghestanians encouraging multilingualism versus disapproval of mixed marriages. So how are these kind of
exactly. Yeah, exactly. This is the case. They disapprove mixed marriages, and they want their children to acquire only one language in their childhood, but at the same time they value multilingualism, and they usually it is rather typical for Daghestani Highlanders to boast the number of languages they speak. When you start asking about languages spoken in the village, they always would find the example of the person who spoke, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 languages. So they value it. But mixed marriages are different matters. So as I tried to show, the second languages were acquired not within the marriages. They were acquired in the communication with the villages, with the residents of other villages, but not within the family. I guess it is compatible. That's what we see in Daghestan.
Thank you very much, Nina. So there are some recent questions by Lotte. Why did the unwantable people find a wife in another village? Sorry. Why would someone from another village want them if they couldn't find anyone in their own village?
Well, yeah, good question. So usually what happened is that man, for some reasons, cannot find a partner in his own village, for example, because he's a widower, or because for some other reason he's an orphan. And so he starts looking for a wife in other villages. And most likely, the woman whom he would find also has some kind of difficulties. So probably she's an orphan, or she has some, or maybe she's lame, or she divorced, or something else. Honestly, it is much more difficult to find out why women entered mixed marriage, because while for men this information is usually disclosed, for women it is hidden. It is usually hidden. People don't like to tell why, what's wrong with woman that she has contracted such a marriage. But usually something was unusual with her indeed. So that's how it happened.
Nina, thank you very much. I think our time is pretty much up. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating and for the questions. There are indeed a few questions left, but I would like to say that we will try to post answers to them under our YouTube video, which will be available after the stream.
Good idea.
So,
thank you very much for your
yeah.
attention, Tanya. And thank you, Tanya.
So please follow our channel, follow our YouTube. And I'd like to remind you again that on Friday, there will be, well, an exceptionally scheduled lecture, so to say, by Johanna Nichols. Please come and participate in it. So we hope to see you again in the rest of the lectures. So thank you. Thank you, Nina, and everyone.
Thank you, everyone.